So welcome everyone to the session today with Alaina. I still don't know how to properly pronounce her last name, so I will leave it up to her. As you know, then L&D Backstage is really about sharing your insights, sharing your knowledge on projects that you're already leading or have implemented. So today we have Alaina shedding some light on how we can make the most of AI tools that are already out there and free to access for everyone to start measuring learning outcomes. I know I'm excited. I know everyone else is also excited. So Alaina, take it away.
Awesome. Well, I am also equally excited to share what I've been doing. I've literally just been playing with tools and learning along the way. So my goal for you here in this 45 minutes is to get some inspiration and ideas for how you can adopt the 3 tools that I'll be showing and other tools. I'm selected 3 types of tools. There are others on the market you may already have access to, like the Microsoft version or any of the other types of tools. So this is just inspiration and the way that this format will go. So I've got 3 essential case studies and demonstrations, and I'm going to literally demo them for you. That will take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to do these demonstrations. And then we'll pause in between each demo, go back into AHA Slides and do some Q&A. I like using AHA Slides because people can upvote questions and I can see easier than Zoom what questions to focus on. So that's how the 45 minutes will flow. A little demo, a little Q&A, and of course, feel free to use the chat at any time. And Anna will be helping me to moderate as well as we go through the 45 minutes. So if you're ready to get started, show me a thumbs up. Whoop, whoop, whoop. We've got just a few people on video. Thank you for joining on video. It makes it more fun for me. And if you're not on video, that's cool too. Also, if you're curious how to pronounce my last name, it's Szlachta. I'm officially Dr. Alaina Szlachta, and my people come from Poland. So I haven't yet been to Poland, but I am 3rd generation, and it's on my bucket list to go visit. So Magda, if you're from Poland, please put in the chat where I should be spending my time visiting, because I know it's a beautiful big country and I don't know how to prioritize my visit there. Anyway, a little bit about me that's not related to AI. Now, without further ado, case study number 1. So this is essentially, how do we take the time away from developing tools that help us with observation? And so essentially developing rubrics is one of the best tools to help create a more standardized approach to observing people. Or even if you were going to use an AI tool, there are many of those on the market that might do the evaluation on your behalf. You still have to train those AI tools. What are the criteria? And the best way to do that training is through clear rubricing to set those expectations. So whether a human is doing the observation, whether it's a self-reported reflection on self, or if it's an AI tool who's doing the evaluation, clear criteria is essential. And creating that can be insanely time consuming. And so how do we use your sort of ChatGPT of choice to take a little bit of that time away and help you get to the more important part of refining and perfecting your rubric? So that's the demo for our first part of the 45 minutes. So a quick reminder, many of you are probably working with a ChatGPT or a Claude or your choice. How I like to think about it, and feel free to chat if you have a different way of thinking about it. I think about these tools, these large language models, in 2 ways. One, I think about it as like a calculator. Like, these are insanely sophisticated calculators that can help us with some things that are just more difficult to do manually, in the same way that a calculator helps us with really complex formulas. Our large language models, or LLMs, are that kind of tool that help us sort of take away the manual, sometimes more sophisticated tasks off our plates. That being said, they're also like having a conversation with a human. So the more context, the more clear our communication is with these large language models, or LLMs, the better output that we're going to get. So I'll be demonstrating with you how to add the context, and then how to also refine a little bit, because again, it's a conversation. You don't have to get it right the first time. you can continue having that conversation with your LLM of choice to get better outputs in the end. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm choosing the skill of active listening because soft skills are something that oftentimes we say it's too hard to measure growth in soft skills. And I'm choosing active listening as a case study. You could fill in the blank with any other kind of soft skill, so long as there's demonstrated research available in the world that discusses best practices on that particular skill. And there's a couple ways you can guide that as well. So here's our first official demo. I'm going to screen share. And oops, before I do that, let me make sure I have my correct window pulled up so that's easier for all of us. Okay, there we go. Now I'm screen sharing and we're going to go into Claude. So I really enjoy Claude over ChatGPT because I like the user experience better. Now that's my personal preference, and each and every one of you are going to have your own preference. I highly recommend that you play around with the different tools. There are many of them. And so Claude for me is my personal favorite. And I like it because it's like, hey, good morning, Alaina. It knows where I am. It feels like a conversation, whereas ChatGPT feels a little bit like I'm using an actual calculator and cold and removed. And anyway, personal preference. So to test out giving me a rubric for evaluating active listening, I'm going to start. There's two options. So option number one is going to be, let's say your organization already has the expectations behaviorally. Maybe there are policies and procedures that already document the expected behaviors. And, or maybe there's research you've already done where you want Claude or your tool of choice to prioritize building a rubric around these documented practices. So what I did in preparation of this demonstration, I did a little research on an academic EBSCOhost equivalent, and I found 5 different papers that specifically talk about best practices for active listening, because I didn't want Claude right away to just search sort of the database of information and create something. I wanted to give it targeted best practices to follow first. And then option number 2 is we don't give it that information and we see the differences. So to do that, first I'm going to upload. Another reason I like Claude is that in the free version, you can also upload documents, and also in the paid version. So here I do have a limitation of 5 documents. Again, these are all peer-reviewed journal articles that talk about best practices around active listening, because maybe my organization doesn't have that criteria already. So remember, this is a conversation. So Claude doesn't know everything. And so I want to give Claude as much context as I can to then give me the outputs that I'm looking for. So I've already prepared my prompts. So I'm going to be copying them here. So first, I want to tell Claude what it is that we're looking at and ask it to summarize so that Claude gets a sense of what's going on in these 5 documents. So these 5 documents are peer-reviewed journal articles describing best practices for demonstrating the skill of active. Oops. So now here's the trick. Can you please create a summary of all best practices in each document? So this is essentially helping Claude to orient itself with all this information. Claude can't necessarily intuit what I want to be looking at. I've also been told from an AI best practices colleague of mine that it's always a good idea to have your LLM summarize the documents that you're working with first, because it gives it the context to then do the next prompting that you want. Also, this gives me a chance to correct because I've already done a quick review of all of these documents, and I know basically what are some of those best practices. And so Claude and all the other LLMs in the world, they are not perfect. And so I want to make sure that there's not anything inaccurate. If I notice something inaccurate, I'm going to give it feedback and ask it to make changes. And interestingly, I did this exercise before this morning, and it doesn't have the error that it came up with the last time we did this. So Claude is getting smarter. I don't see any errors in all of this. Okay, great. So now Claude is primed and prepped with the background information to help me build my rubric. So I don't need to give it any changes. And now I'm going to ask it to build me a rubric. And I like to talk to Claude like it's a human. And, feel free to critique me on that. Claude is not a human. It is artificial intelligence. But I do like to give it like, hey, thank you, or that was great, or this was correct, because for some reason, it just makes me feel better. Okay, so now, can you use the 10 best practices you just listed to create a rubric I can use? So again, I'm giving it context to observe students in an active listening role play activity. Now I'm going to give it a little more context. I would like there to be 6 total criteria and a 5-point scale ranging from poor to excellent, with examples in each area. Let's see what that gives me. So sometimes Claude, or if you're using ChatGPT, sometimes these tools will actually put this data in rubric form, and sometimes it won't. Nonetheless, how I leverage this feedback, I have to copy and paste it anyway. There's no way for me to export this in a rubric, in a table, or whatever your tool of choice is. So nonetheless, I still have to copy and paste. But what I've been given here is exactly what I asked for. So I know that fair is the first option and excellent is the 5th and final option of the examples listed here. And I can see number 1, criteria, attention, observation. Number 2, accepting and non-judgmental attitudes. I can scroll through and I can see that, yes, Claude has accurately pulled from the themes above and has given me 6 criteria that reflect the themes from those peer-reviewed journal articles. And now I can copy and paste and I can put this in a rubric and I can refine it. So my suggestions for you would be present this in front of subject matter experts in your organization or in like a community of people who are experts in the topic, and make sure that there's not any more refinement that would make this an even more effective rubric. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 is to have Claude do this without giving it any prompts. And so it's interesting to then see, okay, well, what's different? And I'm going to copy paste because now I have my prompts and I literally want to do the same thing except without the summary. So I'm going to copy paste this. I'm going to go back and I'm going to do a new prompt. I'll have to change it a little bit. And I'm going to say, can you help me create a rubric I can use to observe students in an active listening role play activity? I would like there to be blah, blah, blah. That all makes sense. Let's see what Claude comes up with. And now we can compare What does Claude come up with without the 5 documents or some context? And how does Claude come up with their own active listening criteria? And what's interesting here is that they're almost identical. And that just may be because active listening is a skill that's well documented, and it is giving really good feedback to then create these rubrics. But I just wanted to show you that you can upload your own criteria or documents, or you can ask the ChatGPT, Claude, or whatever else to just generally create a rubric. And again, this is your starting place. But if I was to have done this, I'm going to go ahead and stop share for now. If I had done this on my own, it would take me hours, even if I was an expert. But in this case, I can get what I need at a super basic level and give me a starting place to then go refine over time and make it even better than starting from scratch. And so for the sake of time, I want to move into the next one, which is a little bit less intensive. It's actually just kind of, hey, here's this cool tool. Did you know about it? And then we'll pause for questions because our final case study is a little bit more in depth around leadership training. So we'll take a little break for Q&A for the first 2 case studies, and then we'll go into the third and wrap up with final Q&A on that last case study. So this next example. So I come from the world of academia, and in academia, my favorite part of being a university student and then a professor was I got access to all the databases, and I could find the latest academic journals on any topic of my choice, and having access to that was so useful. Well, then I went into the corporate world and I no longer had access to any of those things. And I was like, oh, what a sad moment. Now we can actually get access to a lot of that information thanks to artificial intelligence and this other tool called Consensus. So let me get ready my next screen share. And let's dive into Consensus. So we're going to keep with the theme of active listening. So let's say you don't want to use observation and you don't want to use a rubric to evaluate growth and active listening skills because that does take time. Instead, let's say you wanted to have, and again, from my expertise as a researcher and evaluator, the more we can add integrity to our data, the better. And so I love, if I'm going to do a survey that's asking people to self-reflect on growth in a key area, I like to combine that self-reflection with a peer reflection and with an expert reflection. So that's is a basic example of data triangulation, getting feedback from 3 different perspectives or sources on the same activity. So in this case, we could still use a role play, but instead of using a rubric, we could give a 5-point scale that's been created by somebody else with more time to validate the scale than we have. And we can create a sort of self-reflection, peer reflection, and expert reflection survey tool that allows people to quickly then give a scale and a response on their growth. So how would I use Consensus? The value here is in finding all of the scales, which is the term most commonly used in academia, helping us find the scales or the assessments that are available to evaluate one core skill. And so again, active listening is that skill. And here's the prompt that I'm going to use. So and again, it's Consensus wants you to ask a research question. So in the same way that I might ask a research question to Claude, except Claude isn't able to give me the data back because that's not what Claude and LLMs do. But Consensus can score through a ton of different, and I don't know the number, but it's like hundreds of thousands of articles that come from those databases that I used to have access to in my world of academia and give me summaries of these academic papers. So my prompt, what are all the scales, and I'm going to start with scales. I'm going to also ask it for assessments that exist to evaluate active listening skills. So here it's going through this hundreds of thousands, who knows the exact number, but it's a lot of research articles, and it's pulling out the articles that give me insight on what it is I'm looking for. So now I get to go through and I can see, okay, which of these makes sense for the context that I'm specifically working with. If I'm not working with medical consultations, probably going to skip that one. But this one is interesting, development of a listening scale. Let me see if it makes sense. Counseling professionals, maybe that's a little bit too specific. This one here is around hearing. Maybe I'm going to skip that one. This one looks interesting, the active listening attitude scale. I love that. So I've already saved this one. And let's see if there's anything else I want to add to my list. Active listening, empathetic, love that one, already saved that. Development of a science technology, maybe, I did save that one. And you get the idea. So I'm going to go to my saved folder and I'm going to go into my favorites. And here is where I'm going to then go search and try and find the scale itself. So there's a few ways that you can do that. I'm going to copy the name of this here. And let's see, new share. I want to go to, just for now, let's see, I want to go to my, it's not easy to do a quick jump here. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to go into Google Scholar. And then quickly share here. This is just to give you an idea of how do we get these articles. So I am a member of my public library. And in my public library, I have access to EBSCOhost and a few other JSTOR of those academic research databases. And so through my public library card, I can actually get access to many of the articles that would have come up in a consensus search. But Google Scholar is also a great way to do that. It's free. And if the PDF is available, it would show up here next to the title. So unfortunately, in this case, I don't get access to that scale, but I might try with my local university or with my library card trying to get access to that article. Then if I've gotten, let's say, 10 different scales, one of those 10, maybe even more, I will have access to through a quick search. And ultimately, what I'm going to do with those scales is I'm going to take them, and if I can implement it exactly, great. If I need to do a little bit of adjustment for my context, I can do a little bit of changing of the questions or changing of the context, but not too much, because these scales, remember, the value of them is that they come from a valid and reliable test done inside of an academic or a research institution, and that's the value for us. Because one of the greatest limitations for talent development and learning and development is that when we develop our own scales or our own questionnaires or surveys, we aren't experts in doing that design work for assessments, and garbage in, garbage out. If we don't have the time to create the right questions to give us the data that we need, we can't have a lot of faith in the trustworthiness of the data that we get back. And so working with consensus gives us access to some scales that we can then adapt, again, with minor changes, to then use it in our own context. So that, again, would be great for self-report. If you want people to reflect on their own, let's say they do an exercise, or let's say out of training, they have working groups, and in their working groups, they're doing a key activity that helps them practice what they did in training. Then you might have them use one of these scales to self-reflect on their own growth and the activities that they did, something like that. And there's many other use cases. But again, the value here is in getting something that's been validity and reliability tested, because we can't really do that ourselves, because that happens in a very controlled environment that we simply cannot replicate. So before we go into our third and final case study, I'm going to just take a moment and collect some questions here. And it says case study number 1. Think of it as case study number 1 and 2. So go ahead and share your questions. This helps me to see them more easily, because in the chat, questions just come in on a rolling basis. It's hard to visualize them and respond to them. So please type your questions here in the AHA slides. It just helps me to answer them more efficiently. What questions do you have about how we might use Claude or ChatGPT or rubricing, or how we might use consensus, the value of it, and what settings, the prompting that might be necessary to use these tools effectively? What questions can I respond to? And I will take a look at the chat here just for a moment and see if there's a question that popped in I can answer to. Burp, burp, burp. Okay, Brian asks, how would one go about designing a rubric or survey based on a particular piece of content? Okay, so Brian and everybody else that might wonder this, never ever do I evaluate based on content. I evaluate based on the expectation of behavior. What is the task I want someone to be doing? What's the performance I expect them to be doing because they've learned the content. So I wouldn't use any evaluation on the content. Obviously, one question, and you don't need a rubric for this, the way that I would evaluate content would be to ask at the end of a program, how well did this program or the content in this program support you in these expected performance activities, behavior change, etc. So that's how I would approach that. Everything comes down to the expected behaviors, actions that we want people to take after and during our learning program. And that's what makes these rubrics so effective. So how would we translate this into a practice opportunity is what I understand is like, okay, how do we use, whether it's a consensus scale or it's a rubric we create, how do we use this for practice? So for me, feedback is the number one thing that's often missing in a lot of training programs. And so these rubrics or the assessments and scales give people immediate feedback that allows them to then take the next step in self-reflection and say, well, okay, here's how I performed in this practice activity. What support might I need to do this back on the job where I'm not in that safe learning environment? So any kind of feedback they can get from these rubrics and the scales to help them get better at doing the thing we want them to do. Again, everything comes down to the expected behaviors, actions, tasks that translate from the training experience. Next question, how do you think an interface like Claude can be a good learning experience? Well, remember back to if you were at the beginning of the session, we talked about what is the value of a language learning or a large language model, an LLM. The value is it's like a calculator. So I think of how can we help people to learn how to use Claude or ChatGPT in their jobs so that they can get the value of efficiency. That would be the one way that I might incorporate that into a learning experience is like, okay, here's the tasks that you do for your job. Which one of these tasks or 5 tasks might be complemented by using ChatGPT, and then have people practice and maybe they share their best practices with their team. That might be a great way to do that. But I would never use Claude alone as a learning experience. Remember, it's just a tool. What about evaluating project processes, results instead of skills? So one way to do that would be if someone, again, it's what's the output of the project? So is the project a PDF? Is the output of the project a PowerPoint? Is it a video? Whatever the output of the project is, that's what your Claude or ChatGPT is going to be evaluating, or any other AI tool. There are others that can do that. Think about the output. And then if a human was evaluating that output, whether it's video, audio, or a PDF, what criteria would the human need to evaluate that output? Then you create a rubric, and this is where you could use Claude to say, okay, here's an example of a PDF that is the output of a project teaching people how to do X, Y, Z. Can you help me to create a rubric that would help to evaluate the quality of that project? And again, it's not going to get it right because you are the expert to know the expectations of the program, but it can help you to think through different ways of creating a rubric that could then be done at scale using AI. So we have to have clear criteria to evaluate anything. We have to know the output that we're working with, and then you can pick the right tool that could do that for you. So for example, Bongo Learn is a video evaluation tool. If the output of the project was a video, you could then give that tool criteria to evaluate the video. Then the participant would upload their video, and then they would be evaluated based on that predetermined set of criteria. So we have to know, first and foremost, the output of the project. How would we evaluate that output if a human was doing it, create the criteria, and then select the right tool that allows AI to do that evaluation on our behalf. So all great questions. I'm going to pause and go back to our final case study because it's actually my favorite. And then we can do a little bit more time for Q&A. And I do have these questions as well as other questions in our final questionnaire. So this isn't the last time that you'll be able to get feedback from me. I will create a sort of Q&A document and then link that to the recording that goes on YouTube so that folks can continue seeing how we might use AI and answering some of these questions. So the final case study. This is leadership development. So just like soft skills, evaluating leadership is something that is often very tricky. And again, we have to have clear expectations and criteria going into any learning experience to be able to evaluate it. If we don't have those expectations, the best we can do would be evaluating with open-ended questions what people got from the program to help us then maybe create an evaluation for a future program. But ultimately, using AI in evaluation, it's best to do that when we have clear criteria going in of what we expect in terms of change and growth from how people behave, what they think, their perspectives on and attitudes on something. We want to have expectations on that going into any evaluation project. So in this case study, this is something I did recently. I worked with an architecture firm and they did a leadership development training that had 3 phases. Each phase had specific topics that were all designed to help people be better leaders. And we defined what the expectations were for what we wanted people to understand for each topic, what we wanted people to be doing in terms of practices around each topic and implementing that in the workplace, and then how we wondered what people would feel about the topic, and we asked questions about that. So I wanted to share you my process. This is not about AI. This is an actual process of how we might create those expectations from a leadership development program. And Brian's question earlier about how would you use artificial intelligence to evaluate content? We're never evaluating content. Content is the means to the end. We are always evaluating the outcomes that we expected from our programs, and those will always be attitudes, skills, behaviors, actions, and knowledge. But for me, knowledge is a means to an end. And the evaluation should really focus on those actions. So I'm going to jump into phase 2. And what I just want to show you here quickly is the thinking that went into making it possible for us to use AI at a high level. So first, we had to set our expectations. Each one of the phases had 3 topics, and each topic had its own goal. And so you can see for one of them, one of the goals was to demonstrate the ability to create a psychologically safe environment for their teams. And we had expectations that we wanted to test in this evaluation. So the questions I asked, and this is what I asked of the learning team, the people who were in charge of creating the program. Well, what themes do you imagine coming up in conversation around psychological safety that would help us understand how participants understand psychological safety? And so I got an answer from the team. Next was, how do we expect people to feel about psychological safety? And we created an answer here. The next, what activities or practices or behaviors do we expect people to practice to then exercise and create that psychologically safe environment? And so we had an answer here. And then lastly, what other things might you observe in the group while they work on their practice of psychological safety? What other things do we expect might come up? And we've got an answer for that. So that gave me my baseline, my benchmark, my starting place. And that's what we used in our evaluation process. Is we tested, did those expectations get met? Why or why not? And we used Otter.ai to then get answers to these questions of like, what actually happened in the learning groups? So now we know what those expectations are. The next piece of that was recording the conversation. So it's easy nowadays. You can use Zoom for your virtual, record the conversation, or if it's a live classroom, you can also use a number of tools to record the conversation. You don't need the video. In fact, the video is meaningless. You just need the audio. And so what I'm going to share now is my Otter.ai account. And here is just one example of the recording that we uploaded, and we recorded it in Zoom. We uploaded the audio into Otter.ai. And what's so great about Otter and any of the Otter's friends, there's many other Otter alternatives on the market, is that Otter automatically takes the transcript and summarizes it. So remember when I showed you the first case study and I asked Claude to summarize those 5 documents? That's the kind of prep work that we want to do with our AI tools to give them the right context to then be better prepared to do the thematic analysis that I'm about to ask it to do. And so that's why I think Otter is such a great tool for doing qualitative thematic analysis. And the important piece here is the questions that you use. You may have to play around with the questions and then test out the responses that you get with different questions. And I have some examples of that here. But what you're looking at is exactly what you saw in the expectations. I had questions that I asked of the learning team, and now I'm going to ask the same questions of what Otter observes happening in the group conversation. So what themes are present in this conversation around psychological safety? And so Claude then gives me those themes. Otter. I then ask Otter, how does this group feel about psychological safety? And Otter reviews the conversation and provides a summary. Then, what are people doing to facilitate psychological safety? And you could ask this question in a lot of ways. How are people talking about practicing psychological safety? What are some of the calls to actions that came out of this conversation? So there's a few different ways you could ask Otter, and I've tested all of them. And for me, I used the question that gave me the best, most detailed response. I don't think there's a right way. It's just testing the question and see what response you get. And if it's detailed enough to be useful, that's the great question. And then I asked Otter, again, here you can see what are some calls to action to improve psychological safety. And I compared that to my other question around what are some things that were mentioned. And then I ask, of course, my final, what else do you observe about psychological safety that came up in this meeting? And that allows me to capture, are there any other things that might be different themes that would be useful? So then what I did for every single, and we had 2 groups. We had a group in one location and a group in another location. So each group had its own recording uploaded. I asked the same questions. We had 3 different phases, 3 topics in each phase. So I had 9 different topics that I was evaluating. And I ultimately created a database that allowed me to compare expectations with what actually came out in these conversations. So one more quick share, and let me prep that. So I used Notion to organize all of my information because Notion is a really great shareable working document or a working tool. And so here in Notion is where I captured all the data. So what we're looking at here is driving engagement. Driving engagement is one of those 9 different topics that we wanted to explore. Again, what were people understanding about driving engagement? And what were people talking about in terms of feelings and practices and any other themes that might come up? And so what you'll notice is I have a column for expectations. I have a column for what came out of the conversation. And then because triangulation is really useful, I wanted to have the group facilitator record a conversation around what did they observe in terms of the practices, the feelings, and the way people were understanding the topic. And I had Otter do a thematic analysis of those recordings so I could compare what the facilitator observed versus what was talked about directly in the group to see if there were any differences. And I can also then compare that to the broad expectations that we set out at the beginning of the program. And what I would do then is I would say, does this meet my expectation, exceed it, or is it below expectations? And then I can put notes for the learning team that says, hey, here's what is happening. These are the questions I have. This is where we might want to focus for the next time we do this program. And you can see that I've quoted this by the type of exploration. So looking at feelings versus looking at practices versus other versus understanding. And I can then code each one of these. Does it meet expectations? And then any notes or reflections I have while looking at all the data in this one database. So that's one more comprehensive approach where Otter.ai was simply just the tool that allowed me to quickly capture the thematic analysis, but the real evaluation work came in that final database, exploring expectations, observations versus actual outcomes and things that came about in conversations to help me get a sense of, did we meet expectations, why or why not? And then most importantly, in the notes section, what do we do about it? Because that, of course, is incredibly important with what we do with the data. So Anna, we are at time. I'm happy to stick around. I know 45 minutes flies by. I wanted to give you the demos and prioritize that, but I am more than happy to stick around. I'm not sure, Anna, if you have a meeting or if you have somewhere to be, but we can take a little more time here if you'd like to dive into some more Q&A, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely okay from my side. And for the others, also in case you have to step out, feel free to enter your question. We will make sure to capture that, and then you'll be able to either way see it afterwards if everything works out with our recording.
Yep. And feel free to jump off if you cannot stay around, but happy to just spend, 5 or so minutes. And of course, being able to take these questions and then provide answers to them in a document so you all can read that at another time is something I'm happy to do. So let's go back into our AHA slides. Again, that's the easiest way for me to get questions. And thank you everyone for sharing your appreciation. This was a lot of fun for me. So again, final screen share. We're going to go back into our Q&A. And so we'll just keep going with this. So if there are additional questions you'd like me to answer, or if you want to upvote some of the questions that are already here, go ahead and do that. And while you're doing that, I will keep going with the answers. So let's see. We talked about the practice. We talked about Claude as a learning experience. We've talked about project and process evaluation. So the ROI question, this is an interesting one. So where did it go? There we are. So how do we use this for ROI on learning activities? In order to do this well, we have to have good data. So if we're going to use Claude or ChatGPT, we have to give it good inputs. So these AI tools are only able to work with the data that we have access to. They can't make up data for us. And so one of the limitations with calculating an ROI is we have to give it a lot of inputs. We have to know how much, like what's all the data on the time that participants spent and what's the dollar amount on that? What was the time invested in creating the program? What's the dollar amount on that? What's the dollar amount of the technology tools that were used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have to have all that data to give the input on, okay, here's the investment and what's the dollar amount on that. Then we have to look at, well, okay, following the logic model, what were the outputs? What did people do in the training program? What did we expect them to do? Did those expectations get met? And then there's going to have to be some kind of score, like 80% of people completed the program. Well, if 100% of people completed the program, that would be a different ROI than if 80% of people completed the program. So we have to calculate how many people complete the program in the way that we expected them to, meaning maybe they didn't do the whole thing, but maybe they did the most important parts of the program, and we have to get that percent of completion so we can then calculate the ROI accordingly, because we still invested the same amount of dollars whether or not somebody completed the program, right? We still have to account for the total investment of costs, even if only 50% of people completed the program itself. Well, then we have to have clarity on what was the performance. This is always the missing piece with any kind of evaluation, whether it's ROI calculation or simply an impact calculation. We can't jump from people completed training to ROI. That doesn't work at all. There's not even a correlation. Like even if you wanted to say people participated in training and there was a higher retention with this group over another, not enough data. We have to look at performance. And that's where what were we expected performance outcomes, and how do we translate that into a dollar amount? So if it's a sales program, there's very clear and easy ways to track performance. If it's a leadership program, back to Brian's question about, okay, content, we have to be evaluating the performance that we expected. And if people were doing that and, with integrity, that means that we get sort of credit for the outcome. And then what's the dollar amount? If people were doing the performance, let's say 80% of people performed at the expected level or above, okay, then what financially does that do for the organization? Did it increase sales? How did sales change? Did it reduce safety costs? Sometimes training is about preventing safety concerns, and because safety leads to a dollar amount as well for the organization. Or another, risk management. There's really only, when it comes to ROI, there's only like 3 buckets. There's risk management, there's revenue, and what's the other one? Retention, because it's a lot of money every time we have to hire someone. So if retention is the outcome for the ROI calculation, there's a dollar amount there. So we have to have all of that data. If we don't have all of that data, then we can't use any tool to calculate ROI, because we need all of that data. So that for me is why I don't think we're ready to use AI to help us calculate the outcomes in an ROI formula, because we just don't have enough data. We're not collecting it. It's not organized. It's not accessible, because it has to come from the learning activities, the performance side, and the business intelligence data around retention or sales or revenue, et cetera. So I know that's probably doom and gloom, but it's just the reality. Okay, next question. How might you mitigate the effect of recording conversations? So the way that we approach that is we explained very clearly what we were doing and why. And we said to people, gave them a chance to talk about it. So here's how we're going to evaluate. And people care about that. Participants are investing their time and their energy and discomfort into the learning experience. They want to know that it's being evaluated, and they want to know if it met expectations, if it achieved the outcomes, if they get the growth that was promised to them, right? So having a conversation clearly that says, here's what we're doing and why. We're going to record conversations. They're not going to be shared with your boss. They're not going to be recorded in a way that allows us to tie. You saw in my Otter.ai, there were no names. It was just speaker 1, speaker 10, speaker 12. And it wasn't even that important who was doing the speaking, because they were all participants. It was all participants who were engaging. And so it allows for the anonymity that makes that feel a little bit safer. So clearly communicate why you're doing what you're doing and the growth that's promised out of that, and how we're going to evaluate that, how that helps the organization. And you'd be surprised that people will be totally bought into that, because they care about their own growth and the results of their own investment too. So long as you give the data back to them, don't leave them in the dark about the outcomes of that evaluation. Please do give them that information in return. How would you use these for reporting results, not necessarily from surveys? So if you remember the rubric example where I asked Claude to come up with the rubric, I just got text back. So regardless of the feedback I get from Claude, I still have to put it in a format. And that format is totally up to you and whatever, your content or survey delivery method would be. So also, we still have to capture the data. The rubric was just the tool that allowed us to capture the data. We still have to have a place for that data to live. So that might be SurveyMonkey or Google or Microsoft Forms, or like whatever survey tool you're using. You can build a rubric in that. You can build a survey. You can build almost any data collection method you might imagine. The important thing is, once we get that data, we can then plug that back into Claude and say, hey, here are the results of 10 people who participated in this program. Here's the scores that they all had on the rubrics. And can you please analyze this data and tell me sort of a cumulative perspective on the overall scores, how people did in these activities. So we can then take that data, but again, it comes back in text form. Sometimes you can ask Claude to create a bar graph, a pie chart, something like that, if you already know how you want it to be visualized. but it comes back in black and white, boring as all get out. And so we still have to plug that into a visualization tool, whether that's PowerPoint or Power BI. So again, Claude is your tool. It helps you with the analysis, whether it's numerical or thematic. It can help you to create the bar chart, and you might just copy and paste that into a mural board, which is something I've actually done. But you still have to complement AI with the visualization tools, the data collection tools, and then Claude can help you with analysis. Next question. I think I'll go until 30 minutes, so half into half, if that's good with y'all. But keep your questions coming. As I mentioned, I can continue sharing responses in another format asynchronously for y'all. Okay, how would you use AI for the evaluation of leadership after a development program? Well, that depends on the data that you have. So we can't use AI if we don't have any data. So did you collect data? What data did you collect? How can you use that data to then evaluate the outcomes? What were the outcomes? And again, we want to look at those outcomes as much as possible from a behavior and performance perspective, especially for leadership. I hate to say it, but I don't care about knowledge. It's a waste of time to evaluate knowledge growth, because what we care about, at least in the corporate world, is behavior change and performance growth. If you're working for a university, if you're working for a nonprofit that's got a program that's teaching young people, how to do certain things, okay, sure. Knowledge is the outcome, because that's the whole goal of your program, is to give young people or to give, new workers knowledge to help them get jobs or be successful, sure. But in the corporate world, performance is the only thing that the business cares about, and that's the data that we want to be collecting. So if you don't have that data to show changes in performance, to compare before and after the leadership program, AI isn't going to be helpful. So we got to have the data to have AI be a good help for us. The next piece, how do we deal with the sensitivity of interviews uploaded to an AI? So we're a global organization, or we're a global community is a better way of using that, which means every country, sometimes even states and communities, deal with data privacy differently. So I've heard in all the conferences that I speak at, we can't use AI because the data laws, regulations in our organization or in our country don't allow that. And so what I would do is, if you need to be compliant, I would work with the compliance department, whether that's, a council at the government level, community level, or even like a board, for example, and present, here's what we'd like to do. How can we do this in a compliant manner? And they will give, just like when I do research at the academic level, I have to present to my board how I'm going to collect data and how I'm going to mitigate the risks ethically of collecting that data. We can still do that in the corporate world or any other world that we're in, and then get feedback. Just like when I was in an academic institution, my review board said, yes, you can do these things and add these safety measures in. So anonymity, coding people's names with numbers. Like there's a lot of different ways that we can protect the privacy of people's data and get the feedback directly from the source of your regulatory board to then make sure you're following their compliance so you don't get in trouble later. Yes, it takes more time, but the benefit of now being able to use AI to increase your productivity is huge. So I think it's worth it in the end. One more question and then we'll wrap up. For Otter.ai, doing thematic analysis, to what extent do you think the qualitative analysis is reliable? What would you recommend to pay attention to or do to make it more reliable? So one, I would test my questions and test the responses. And I'm always aware of what's happening in the conversation myself. So I have a human quality assurance measure where I can look at those themes. I can go back through the transcript myself, and I can make sure that those themes make sense. Another way I can test that is to test a couple of different AI tools. So I tested Otter, Claude, and ChatGPT to see how they might respond. And each of the tools responded in the same way with the same prompts, which tells me that at least the outputs are going to be consistent, which is a reliability measure. But the quality, is it accurate, which is another question. I have to do a little bit of human quality assurance to then test, okay, if let's say I have 9 conversations that I'm evaluating, if I spot check like 3 of those 9 and I feel like the responses I'm getting from Otter or ChatGPT or Claude are useful and accurate, then I feel like I can I can rely on that all 9 of those conversations will have credibility in that way. So all awesome questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop share. There's a ton more questions. Thank you. Looks like we have 17 people who are still with us, even 15 minutes after. So thank you for being here and giving an hour of your time. I hope this was helpful. In the AHA slides, there is a link to subscribe to my newsletter. I publish it every weekend. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and there's a way to subscribe there. But I'm just a big old data and evaluation nerd, and I publish on tips, tricks, and thought leadership on how to make measurement easier. And if that's of interest to you, please find me on LinkedIn and subscribe. And that's all from me. Anna, any last words from you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so, so much, Alaina. I don't know about you guys, but I have a ton of notes here of what to do. Still very old school, I know, but I have a ton of notes on how to use these and already some ideas on where I can put already these learnings to practice. So thank you so much for sharing and really deep diving with us, Alaina. This has been really great. I can see also from the comments it has helped. Thank you also everyone who has joined us today. Continue then supporting our Shakers community. If there's any other topics you would like us to bring up, please let us know. In the meantime, keep an eye on our communication channels. Get in touch with Alaina if you haven't done so yet. And yeah, thank you. Just wishing you a great rest of the day wherever you are. And thank you for staying with us this long.
Awesome. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for having me.